Okay, please correct me if I'm wrong. All offseason we heard from scouts about basically these 6 quarterbacks. Drew Aller from Penn State, Garrett Nusmire from LSU, Lenora Sers from South Carolina, Arch Manning from Texas, Cade Clubnick from Clemson, and John Mateer from Oklahoma. These were 6 of the biggest names for the 2026 NFL Draft, but so far, all of these guys have been underwhelming. In today's video, I want to talk about these 6 quarterbacks, how they've done this season, and why their stock has fallen off. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's go ahead and get started and talk about these big-time NFL draft prospects who have lost their draft stock. Okay, so the first guy I want to talk about is Mateer. He was considered a late first round pick or probably a day 2 pick, but after an early start to the season, his stock went through the roof. After being a little-known recruit coming out of high school, he was identified by Eric Morris and ended up at Washington State, where he absolutely blew up in 2024. Last season, he passed for over 3,000 yards and 29 touchdowns, while also rushing for nearly 1,000 yards and 15 scores. He became a top 3 quarterback transfer in the portal and decided to go to Oklahoma with his offensive coordinator. Mateer was going to be the guy that could save Oklahoma football, and through the first few games, he looked pretty solid. He ended up having 300 yards and 4 touchdowns against Illinois State, nearly 400 yards and 3 touchdowns against Michigan, and then 2 touchdowns against Temple. He did struggle with interception, as he did have a pick in his first 3 games, but then after a close win over Auburn, it was announced that he was going to need hand surgery. Unfortunately, this would sideline him for a bit, and he was rushed back against Texas. Michael Hawkins filled in his place, but against Texas, Mateer was horrendous. He ended up only throwing for 200 yards with no touchdowns and 3 interceptions, as they got beat 23-6 by the Longhorns, and that loss looks worse by the week, as Texas is currently on life support. Mateer has not been much better since then, as against South Carolina, he went 18 of 26 for 150 yards and a touchdown. Then this past weekend against Ole Miss, he went 17 of 31 for 200 yards and a touchdown. Sure, he didn't throw picks in these last 2 games, but it's because the ball wasn't going anywhere near anybody. There were so many times at the end of that Ole Miss game where Mateer just overthrew or just made a terrible read, and I'm not sure what's going on. Is it the injury? Is it the confidence? Is it the system? I have no clue. All I know is John Mateer doesn't really look himself, and for a guy who was supposed to be able to use his legs, they haven't done much of that in the last couple of games. I truly don't know what's going on, but John Mateer went from a Heisman favorite and a first round pick to looking like he's going to need another season at Oklahoma. The second guy I want to talk about is Cade Clubnick. He was a 5-star recruit coming out of the state of Texas, and early on at Clemson, he looked like he was going to be a star. He had 2,800 yards in 2023, and then last season, he absolutely blew up. He completed 64% of his passes, had 3,700 passing yards, 36 passing touchdowns, and also 500 yards and 7 scores on the ground. It looked like Cade was finally coming into his own, and he was considered the number 1 overall draft pick according to ESPN in the offseason. I saw mock draft after mock draft putting him to the Cleveland Browns, and so far in 2025, he's done anything but live up to that hype so far. It all started in week 1 against number 9 LSU, as we thought the Tigers were much better then, but in that game, Clubnick went 19 of 38 for 200 yards and failed to score a touchdown, but made sure to have an interception. They lost that game, and his confidence seemed shot. They also struggled against Troy before pulling it out in the end, and then they lost 2 straight games to Georgia Tech and Syracuse. To be fair, Cade had 3 touchdowns in that Syracuse game, but something is just off. Besides a 4-touchdown performance against North Carolina, we also ended up seeing Christopher Vezina come in because Clubnick is dealing with an injury, and in his latest game against Boston College a couple weeks ago, he had 280 yards with a touchdown and a pick. So far, Clubnick has just not been himself. He's turning the ball over more, he's not commanding the offense, he's not putting up as many yards, and he's not using his legs. I really don't know what's going on, but it seems like something is messed up here at Clemson too. The injury isn't going to help him, and while I still think Cade could be a day 2 draft pick, he needs to have a good end of the season, and he needs to get healthy, but for being a number 1 overall pick guy, he has not played that well. The third guy we're to talk about is Garrett Nusmire. The son of a former NFL assistant coach, Garrett waited his turn coming out of high school, and the 4-star eventually took over during the 2024 season after being stuck behind Jaden Daniels. Nusmire absolutely blew up in 2024, throwing for over 4,000 yards with 29 touchdowns and 12 picks. He was a pure pocket passer, which is why the NFL was in love with him going into this year's season. He was considered a top 10 pick by pretty much every scout and every draft network, but so far this year, Nusmire has not impressed. He had 1 touchdown in their Week 1 win against Clemson, 1 touchdown and a pick against Louisiana Tech, a touchdown and a pick against Florida, and through the first 3 games, he didn't do anything special. Cool, he had 4 touchdowns against an FCS school in southeastern Louisiana, but then he played some better competition. He had under 200 yards and an interception in a loss to Ole Miss, had 2 interceptions against South Carolina, lost the game on the road to Vanderbilt, and then against Texas A&M, he had 168 passing yards and 1 touchdown. Nusmire has not had one good performance against a good team this year, and so far he only has 1,800 yards and 12 touchdowns with 5 picks. Those are not the kind of numbers that are to get him drafted, and looking around the internet, many are wondering if he'll start the remainder of the season. With an interim head coach, anything can happen at this point, and Nusmire is just not the same. I guess the same traits that NFL scouts like are still there with Garrett, but if I'm taking a quarterback in the first round, I'm not taking Garrett Nusmire, and to me, he's a day 2 or day 3 pick right now, if that. A few hours ago, I did my video about Drew Aller and how he fell from grace, and going back in time, he was a 5-star recruit coming out of Medina, Ohio. He was supposed to be the next Christian Hackenberg, but actually develop at Penn State, and through his first 2 years of being a starter, he had over 6,000 passing yards and nearly 50 touchdowns. He also helped Penn State make a deep run in the 2024 college football playoff, and after he could have been probably a 2nd or 3rd round pick, he would decide to come back for the 2025 season. Scouts said he checked every single box, but he just needed to refine his game and finally prove that he had the it factor. Unfortunately, it has been anything but that in 2025, as he didn't do much in their first 3 games against Nevada, Florida International, or Villanova, and that was weak competition. I guess they didn't really need to spice up the playbook in those first 3 games, but then against Oregon, he struggled. He played well in the 4th quarter, but then in overtime, he had a terrible telegraphed interception to Dylan Thieneman, and they lost at home in the whiteout game. This proved that Aller had not stepped up, as he had lost pretty much every big game in his career, and then after that, it just spiraled out of control. On the road against UCLA the following weekend, they had one of the worst losses in FBS history, as they were a top 10 team that lost to a horrible UCLA team. Aller didn't play all that well in that one, and then against Northwestern, he only had 100 yards and an interception before he would eventually go down with a leg injury that has sidelined him for the remainder of the season. He may be able to get a medical red shirt, but I'm not sure, and if he does, he'll probably come back at this point, but if he doesn't, he's probably a day 3 pick right now. He may have had a bigger fall from grace than anybody because everyone expected him to be the number 1 overall guy and the franchise quarterback of the 2022 high school quarterback class. Our 5th guy on the list is going to be Lenora Sers. After flipping between Syracuse, Virginia Tech, and then eventually South Carolina, the 4-star recruit had a couple of great plays his freshman year, which led to him getting hyped up in 2024. Besides a few injuries, Sers was tremendous last year, throwing for 2,500 yards and 18 touchdowns, while also rushing for nearly 700 yards and 7 touchdowns, and making big-time explosive plays, especially in the clutch. That's why he was a projected top 5 pick going into this year, and so far, Sers has just not been able to capitalize. He only has 1,300 yards with 6 touchdowns and 3 picks, and his rushing numbers are down to 175 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also had a costly fumble recently, and he also dealt with an injury where he took a shot to the head. I'd say it's been a perfect storm of a disaster for Sers this year, as not all of this is his fault, and something just seems to be off. Maybe the Anthony Richardson comparison isn't fair, but that's sort of what I feel like with Sers going into the NFL. A really good athlete who has a lot of potential, but I'm not sure if he develops. Sers, in my opinion, is one of the most exciting players in college football when healthy and given a real chance, but so far this year, he has not lived up to the hype, but he still has a quarter of a season to save it and figure things out. And finally, the last guy I want to talk about is Arch Manning. You guys probably all knew this was coming, as the number 1 overall recruit in the country may not be as good as all the recruiting profiles indicated, but Arch Manning has struggled this year, and he's honestly been set up to fail in my opinion. After having nearly 10 touchdowns as a backup to Quinn Ewers last year, it looked like it was going to be Arch's year to take over, but we all saw in week 1 that it wasn't really going to go according to plan. Against Ohio State, he went 17 of 30 for 170 yards with a touchdown and a pick, but that was his first start, and it was against an elite defense. He had 5 touchdowns against San Jose State, and then he was okay against UTEP and Sam Houston, but once he got back into SEC play, he has just struggled. He had 2 touchdowns and 2 picks in a loss to Florida, and he could have had a 3rd interception. And then in a win over Oklahoma, he just had 1 touchdown. These last 2 weeks have been horrendous for him, as against Kentucky, which is not a good team, he went 12 of 27 for 132 yards without a touchdown or a pick, and he only completed 44% of his passes. Against Mississippi State, he figured it out in the second half, as he did have 346 yards with 4 total touchdowns, but he got hit in the head, and he's now in concussion protocol. There's some debate about whether he should be the long-term starter, but I think with how much money they probably gave Manning, there's no way they can bench him for Caldwell. We'll just have to wait and see, but nobody's talking about Arch Manning going off to this draft class anymore, and everyone assumes he'll come back for next season. I doubt he'll end up transferring, but for being labeled as the best quarterback to ever exist, Arch Manning has not had a great season, and his draft stock is not very good right now. But yeah, what do you guys think? Why do you think all these quarterbacks have fallen off? Who is your favorite quarterback prospect for 2026? And which topic should I do next? Be sure to let me know down below. Leave a like if you need to support today's video. Subscribe if you're new. And check out one of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon. But until next time, peace.